Welcome everyone. It's very exciting to have everyone on the platform today. This is Ubuntu, a global dialogue with Africa. I'm Kalu Osiri, and with me on the panel is Professor Mammo Muchie, and I am doing something a little bit different today. I'm actually in my backyard today, so I'm enjoying the nature. So I hope you can hear me well. So we have a format today that allows all our attendees to be able to go on in the chat room and post questions or chime in. So feel free to go to the chat room, or you can actually use the Q&A. If you have questions, go ahead and use the Q&A to ask questions. So Professor Muchie, Professor Mammo Muchie, you are welcome. We're going to continue our conversation from last time on excavating indigenous African knowledge. And I think you are adding another dimension to it, which is integrating. Not only should we excavate, we should also integrate indigenous African knowledge. Professor Muchie, please, you have the floor. Thank you for coming.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that what the university, the new university, which is the African university, not the university in Africa, but an African university. And I very much like to start with some inspiration to motivate us. And my main focus today is how we can include the excluded indigenous knowledge in the education system in Africa. And then I very much like to bring the distinctive traits of indigenous knowledge in Africa, some examples I want to give, and what value does indigenous knowledge bring to Africa? What kind of actions are missing that we need to take to promote indigenous knowledge? How can we extend the indigenous knowledge to promote and enrich the education system without excluding any other knowledge in the universe? And what is the difference between indigenous and what is called Western knowledge, Western generated knowledge? And in what, if there are differences, what are the differences? And is there a way we can also create what I call epistemological fusion between them, and therefore we can make it more holistic rather than being selective, but also find new ways, new synergies, new hybrid imagination that actually allow us to develop new knowledge and then expand it and enrich it and innovate it. I also would like on the science, technology, engineering, mathematics side, a lot of the indigenous knowledge usually are with dreams, spirits, and so on, but extraordinary achievements have been made in Africa on the science, on the mathematics, on the engineering, on architecture, many things like that, on the writing systems. In the writing systems, for example, the country where I come from, Ethiopia, used to be called also Africa. Ancient Kemet, ancient Egypt, all that was Ethiopia. It's a great country which has given, the name Ethiopia means a lot. Ethiopianism is what started Pan-Africanism, and it's a very powerful movement. And I think we should all save Ethiopia because it's important that it's like the indigenous knowledge. It's also another indigenous knowledge. Ethiopia is indigenous knowledge for you. So, but it gets excluded, attacked, yeah, and a lot of enemies because it actually created very strong spiritual strength and wealth for Africa by not being colonized. But then, of course, those that are that like colonialism also do not like Ethiopia. And when they don't like Ethiopia, it's also they don't like Africa, because Africa needs to be decolonized. So those kinds of things, this philosophy is also very, very important. So we need to know, now what I thought of doing is the kind of curriculum I want to develop myself, I'm working on it, is to transform the African education curriculum by including indigenous knowledge in science, in STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. And I want to include it not just by creating each separate silo, disciplinary silo, but also applying the unity of knowledge, where I bring in the human sciences, social sciences, the economics, and natural and engineering sciences, and astronomy, and all of them come together in some interesting unity, so that our students actually learn something new about how to also understand the knowledge universe. We need to create a new velocity of light in the knowledge sphere that we have lost many, many times. Unfortunately, what seems to really has been occurring to us is the velocity of light of hate and division. And all these things we need to kind of reverse it, that gravity burden of hate and fighting and division, all that has to be changed with the Ubuntu. It's amazing this university that Osiris is a university based on the values of Ubuntu, which is extraordinary. That's why I'm attracted. And when my brother asked me, the professor who is guiding this and initiated this important project of creating the African University, I said yes when I saw Ubuntu, because we need it. I would also like us to do what kind of research do we need, including some ideas I have. I would suggest that to you, including some ideas about how we can set up journals. We've done a few journals. One of them is called the African Journal of Science, Technology, Innovation, Development. It's become now very well established. Thank God. It's good that I'm one of these people who don't have a house. I live very humbly. I don't like big things. Money and all these things make me upset, and why people kill each other for silly things like that. But knowledge is very, very good. I think if you deny me knowledge, I'll be very upset. But if you deny me money, I don't care. My father told me you should give money you should give anything to others, even beg to give them, he used to say. Don't ever take, he used to say. So I will then do some recommendations and some conclusion. And I thought we'll do it. But now let me start with a little poem to you. My inspiration today is poetry. The world is still divided by implicit or explicit classifications of inferiority and superiority. Africans have not yet fully removed coloniality. They still prefer to look and affirm each other by mimicking externality. There is still failure to appreciate their full humanity by asserting their rich Africanity. African identity continues to be subtracted by a degrading psychic dislocation. Africans using external colonial presence by defining themselves with division, like Lusophone, Francophone, Anglophone, ethnic phone, language phone, religion phone, gender phone, and so on and on. Africa is not a phone. Africans must treat one another as human family, practicing Ubuntu truly, building the Osiris African University with Ubuntu value really. They need to do that. Not call some Africans as relatives and others as aliens. Africophilia must replace all the divisive forms that turn the African one family as strangers. Africa must overcome others' continued demand to maintain their claims to superiority. Africa can reject it by applying the knowledge heritage that there is no justification to continue any form of inferiority. We have a rich knowledge heritage, a rich spiritual heritage, a spiritual heritage that will save America now. America is in a mess now. America needs a humane health industrial complex, not a military industrial complex. Where would they get that? From our Ubuntu, from our math, from our values, extraordinary values, even the Ethiopian philosophy, where all by the way that Africans and all the oppressed people felt by the name of Ethiopia, that they said that by remaining, fighting and struggling, surviving, it has also given us strength, they said. So that kind of humanity is very, very, very important. But by all Africans coming together with knowledge and innovation to realize their full equality, to practice the cherished rich African value of Ubuntu, one in all and all in one humanity. Win with the exposure of indigenous knowledge, Africa's younger generation. Let's try to do that now and make with knowledge African unity as a grand inspiration. To give inferiorizing Africa and superiorizing others a big blow. Let us all strive and go always for the best of the best. Let your intellect continue to shine. Remain bright, spiritually and humanly genuine. Let your spirit glow. Remain blessed and keep strong. Never fail as united Africans to remove all that is wrong. So let's remove all the wrong. Let's bring what is right. Let's do the really very strong inclusion of the indigenous knowledge in the education system that it has not been done. Education in Africa disregarded indigenous African knowledge system. This is not done because Africans wanted to do it. It's because the education system was inherited from the colonial time. And in the colonial time, the Western hegemonic education disregarded anything from Africa. They did not want to value what was created from Africa, even if when they have done some extraordinary things like stealing so much knowledge from Africa, they never acknowledge that they took it from Africa. They plagiarize all our knowledge. For example, the country where I come from, you would not believe in the ancient manuscripts, that existed for thousands of years from the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Those manuscripts, you know how many of them are? More of the manuscripts are actually abroad in different countries in Europe than they are in Ethiopia themselves. It's extraordinary. I don't know how that happened, but if you go to France, if you go to Germany, if you go to Italy, if you go to Britain, if you go to America, if you go to Canada, I cannot tell you. So many of our ancient manuscripts are there. In fact, we had a webinar on discussing even some of I really have to respect some of the American professors. They themselves are saying that some of these manuscripts must be returned. The interesting thing is, at least the Germans also, they are often, they tell you frankly, they said, in fact, I was in the British Library and King's Cross, and there were 9 pages written. A German has written it, saying that almost all the pharmaceutical knowledge that we Germans got it from Ethiopia's manuscripts. That's what they say. The interesting thing is, in that church, it's not just simply religious things that they write. Almost on everything they have reflected upon it. For example, even on the planet, on the stars and the astronomy, it's extraordinary. There's a book called Abu Shakar, an amazing book, where the prediction is over 9 planets exist in the universe. So very fascinating things have been, extraordinary knowledge have been created and even fractal mathematics. You not believe it. I mean, I'll tell you a little bit about mathematics, so the binary logic mathematics and so on. I mean, it's not just in, and then of course astronomy, the Dogon, amazing, and all the science, all these sciences. You know who recognizes them? All Western scientists do recognize them. I mean, you would not believe. I'll tell you a little bit more and more how extraordinary things have been created by Africa. For example, this ancient language called Giz in Ethiopia, they don't teach it very well. I mean, I should have been taught that language. I learned many other languages, but I should have learned Giz language. But you know how many universities teach it across the world? All in Western countries, most of them. Yeah, in Germany and others, even PhD programs are being given in Giz. And I'm just wondering that when I say we need to bring indigenous knowledge, we must also bring this extraordinary knowledge. This knowledge is very, very important. In fact, now with my brother, Professor Sunday Ojo, we're now working on digitalizing African languages. And we're thinking even the alphabet, because we have our own alphabet, which is our own extraordinary. We should be very proud of it, and we should be able to use it also, even not just for Ethiopian, for the language that it came from, but also for even all African languages, because it's our language. And this alphabet is extraordinary because it expresses sounds that about you would not believe what it expresses. And then Sylvester, you know, Robinson, there was a professor who started he's Swedish, Stephen Robinson is his name, and professor, he said in the 2007 when we had the millennium, the Ethiopian calendar, also we have our own calendar. He says both the calendar and also the alphabet, he said, is the most extraordinary. He said it's superior, he said, to the Latin alphabet or the Roman alphabet. That's what he said. Even the extraordinary things the Westerners accurate, I really respect them. You know, like what I heard also when George Floyd lots of Americans. I'm really proud to hear this. White Americans are now protesting against racism, which is good. I think we should also really be more universal, and that's very, very important. Sorry for being a bit distracted, but let me just say this. The lack of education has distorted African people's way of seeing themselves with confidence to act and address, to solve any problems without depending on outsiders. The fact that we need to bring indigenous knowledge is that if our generations, all the youth, entirely the African youth, which is many of them are the majority are African young people, if they know that there has been extraordinary creations from our ancestors and that we recorded it and show it and clearly with evidence, show them, that will make them powerful because they will learn how to act and to address and solve any problem without trying to imitate and mimic outsiders. African identity has been degraded with loss and exclusion of indigenous knowledge in the education system. So we need to bring back the African identity. It should not be a reverted identity of Western identity. It shouldn't be like that. If you notice that we still have problems because there's no evaluation of us as ourselves. We completely copy. We must stop that, stop mimicking. We must be ourselves and then relate to anyone equally with anyone. That's the best way to do it. Long overdue, but not time to revive and reassert the significance of indigenous African knowledge. It's long overdue that we have not done it, but we should now use the time to revive and reassert the significance of indigenous African knowledge back by including it in the curriculum. We should not rely on the knowledge hegemony from the colonial determined discourses on education for Africa. We should not have African universities in Africa. We should have African universities that genuinely and tangibly and measurably and effectively and productively have actually included all the scope of the knowledge universe that Africa has generated on every sphere that we need to do, and we need to know how to do it. What are the distinctive traits of indigenous knowledge in Africa? Indigenous knowledge embodies the life world, the network interactions, the context, the experience, the natural settings that the African people live in. It has been generated, not from one source, from a whole variety of sources. Even the way we do our interactions, the different contexts we are in, the experience we go through in life, all kinds of experience from each other, one-to-one, to communities, to the way we govern, the way we understand justice. How do we treat those who commit crime? Do we use punitive justice, put them in jail? Or do we use what's called rehabilitative and restorative justice? In other words, we revive them, make them, make them really listen to what they did is wrong and they apologize. How do we make them things like that? Indigenous knowledge is part of the universal knowledge having been generated in Africa, in the Africa-specific context. We cannot say that because we recognize indigenous knowledge, we exclude the universal knowledge, all other knowledges. In fact, our indigenous knowledge should enable us, capacitate us to actually be open to all the universal, the knowledge universe. So the universal knowledge is not excluded, including the Western knowledge, any other knowledge is not excluded, because we inherited, revived, reasserted, reclaimed our own indigenous knowledge. Indigenous knowledge has existed for thousands of years in Africa, providing practical application for the survival in daily lives of all the communities, particularly those who are living in the rural local areas. I really must tell you that when I was a young boy, my aunt, I call her Talem, she used to take me to the rural areas, and she goes to the plants, and she used to get some medicine and rabies and all this. She used to treat them, and I noticed people were being treated. Then I said to her, Talem, I want to know. I really like what you're doing, because I saw these people who were about to die. You said you made them survive in one day. How did you do this? She says, she used to call me Katamaye. Katamaye, you know what? When you know, if I tell you now, if you see it, it will lose its medicinal value. But I tell you, you are the only one I will inform later, when you grow up a bit, that when you can handle it. You know, you're the only one that I will tell, and then you can handle it. You know why? That's her intellectual property. She's trying to protect the intellectual property, because I'm a young boy. I'll be very excited. I saw it, and then I'll say to my other friends, and my other friends will say it. Then they will take it. So she didn't want to do that. But what amazed me was how I see. Imagine that thing. The key thing is, I don't even know the plants she used to do, but she used to go to it's dense. She picks it up. She gives it to them. I noticed the way the people were doing it, the way they were, you know, all over, moving around and fragilating, and then eventually they get cured. That's what I saw. So the distinctive traits of indigenous knowledge. Indigenous knowledge is holistic knowledge. It's knowledge that defies disciplinary silos. Very, very important. When we do indigenous knowledge excavation, it's going to be a challenge, because some of us are luckily transdisciplinary. I did many things, physics, many things, mathematics, everything. We're now publishing a book on engineering design, mathematical modeling, all kinds of stuff. I mean, I do many things, but the most important thing is it would be very good, some of us really comprehensively evaluate how we can actually create a holistic, as a holistic knowledge, all the disciplines that come, how we manage them, so that we do not reduce the disciplinary content, but at the same time enrich it by actually including, by making it inclusive. So how do we make it a holistic knowledge is very important. Indigenous knowledge addresses all dimensions, aspects of human interaction with space, with matter, with water, with land, with spirit, and all of human beings are also engaged in it. And it's derived from various sources. So these characteristics actually have impact on the way we actually can create on the curriculum. How do we educate the people on this indigenous knowledge? How do we expose the younger generation, get to know them, and systematically upgrade it, and really make it more inclusive, and not just something that just people just exposed to, but without really adding this knowledge that actually can also create new learning, new practical approaches, new policy learning, anything like that we can have. So distinctive traits for this, and what are the sources for the indigenous knowledge? The historical events, the ancestral wisdoms, the generational oral transmission from different communities, the observations that can be empirical ways of knowing. The way, you see, they do observations, but they may not record it empirically, but they may tell it in a story. But what would be very interesting is some of us now who know how to do data collection, empirical studies, how we can also observe it and find that that is very, very important. Also revelation, revealed knowledge acquires through dreams, visions, and spiritual bodies, those kinds of things. So there are many sources for way to understand the indigenous knowledge. So it's very, very interesting, distinctive traits emerge from it. So indigenous knowledge is often locally created knowledge. In other words, in many, probably most indigenous knowledge now still exists in the rural areas, in the agricultural sphere. The majority of our people in Africa are in agriculture still. That's what it says. The percentage is even nearly 70% or so. That's what they are saying, that most people are in the rural areas. But these people survived. I mean, many things. The way what food they eat, how they produce it, what they do, how they explain it. All right, do we know it very well? Those of us who are in the academy should be able to go and find out and record it, study it, systematize it, and actually and use some of it to actually upgrade it, innovate it. Things like that we should do. It's knowledge that's applied in specific communities related to their way of living. So the key thing is it's locally created. It's also knowledge that's applied in specific communities to their way of living, how they can manage their life. It's not knowledge that African students currently learn in schools and universities. All right? In the different cultures and in the different societies, communities are not very well embedded. Indigenous knowledge has been a lifesaver resource for the provision of health care. For many people in the rural areas, they don't have hospitals. They have different health care. They do the farming in a different way. They don't use the current technology to do it. They select hygienic food preparation. They do it like that. We don't sometimes. In fact, we think now with all this food being now manufactured and all this industry, the food loss. One of my students is doing his PhD thesis on food loss and food waste and food hurt, that the damage health, food health, how those things could come, and we're working on it, and he's doing his data now. Very fascinating. I'm learning a lot from him. So what, yeah, very interesting things are happening. So we have indigenous knowledge also on the education side. Again, there's not much inclusion in the education of these things that I'm just telling you. And also on learning how to manage and utilize resources. And a range of other activities in the rural communities that people, their life hold, the entire life world has knowledge. It's indigenous knowledge, but it's not recorded and coded. And therefore it's mainly tacit and it's not explicit knowledge. So because of that, we don't know it. And I think the people in the universities, the main task should be for them not to go and just copy all the knowledge other people have created from the Western world, but they should be really upgrading, innovating the indigenous knowledge that has been occurring in our area. So what value has indigenous knowledge now? It's knowledge resource base. It's a resource base for Africa, which can facilitate our communication, even change our decision making in some of the things we do, the wrong things we do, some of the things we have copied from outside, and continue to even fight each other when we should be united and love each other. Those things we can use. The indigenous knowledge is a long history and it's been a long memory. What is it that people have done when they had difficulties? How did they solve it? How did they turn attacks into defense? How did they turn, what are the trends and opportunities that we can see from them is what we need to do. It can serve to generate a creativity and innovation. We could, from information resources and experimentation, by not excluding other knowledge sources. A library of indigenous information system that can dynamize the communities can be promoted. So these kinds of things can be also done and well done. And I think it's very, very fascinating if all these things can be done. So what kind of action should we take to promote indigenous knowledge? We need to redefine indigenous knowledge as a systematic body of knowledge discovered by local people. It may not be scientific, but it is knowledge. And the knowledge type we need to identify. In other words, maybe there's a scientific part to it. Maybe there are other parts to it. But we need to do the research to actually evaluate and make sure that we actually use it properly. We need to build on the accumulated experience to create new knowledge discoveries. We need to do that. In other words, the accumulated experience of all history that people had, if we are able to capture it, we can actually use it to create new knowledge discoveries too. And the discoveries may be amazing, meaning they'll be new in many, many areas, unexplored ones, and so on. So, and on every sphere, not just in one area, but in the land, air, space, whatever, but all other spheres. So maritime, aeronautics, many things like that, all the things we could do. And we could encourage and support the local peoples for them to continue the informal experiments. You see, they may be, even when they do this indigenous knowledge, we don't know, even if though they may not have a laboratory, they may have their own mode of experiments. What is the kind of experiment they did in order to fabricate or create some knowledge? We need to also learn that too. We need to discover, record, and code how the local community continues to understand and know the culture and environment they are in. That's very, very important. That is what we really need to do. What universities in all Africa must do is actually go back to the roots, go and link up with the communities, learn how to discover, to record and code, how the communities have been trying to understand all the challenges they face, everything they face, you know, in the droughts, many things that can happen. How did they manage it? How did they do it? What's the culture? What's the environment that they're operating on? Is very, very important to do. So we need to also extend indigenous knowledge to serve. By serve, I mean acquiring skillfully through an extended inquiry to know all the local or traditional knowledge that's a variety of cultures. How do we go about going through all the communities and the way they express their relationship in terms of with knowledge? How do we extend the inquiry so that we understand the traditional knowledge that they have accumulated over many, many years through their ancestral connections? How do we do it? How do we develop a systematic teaching approach to plan and make organized knowledge exchange and learning? How do we create problem-solving indigenous knowledge mechanism to transform all rural communities? That's very, very important. In other words, instead of always copying other knowledge, if there is already existing indigenous knowledge, what mechanisms can we create actually to upgrade it and innovate it to actually make sure that rural communities are transformed? In this digital time, there's not much problem to actually do many things. Many things are now happening. Many changes are taking place. So we could even use this new technology also with the indigenous technology, and new synthesis and new combinations could come. We can create indigenous knowledge to have explicit relevance to improve the lives of the people entirely free from poverty without loss of their identity and culture. That's very, very important. The indigenous knowledge can also be a resource for attacking poverty, attacking unemployment, and creating a much more genuine, climate-friendly environment. All these things, all the key things we need to do now, as the world now is in a very difficult time. As you know, we are in a pandemic, I don't know, where this COVID-19 disorder, global disorder, and when it will be in an order, it's not easy. But if people learn how to live a life decently in terms of with the intelligence, where they do not mess up the environment, but they actually also protect it. All these things we do as we go on in life, I think what would be is that we protect not just ourselves, but also the environment, everything, nature, and human relationships, everything are done very properly, then I think this indigenous knowledge could be really explicit relevance to improve the lives of the people entirely, with freedom from all kinds of poverty and many other dangers and attacks that we are at the moment the world is in. So the indigenous knowledge heritage revival, how do we go about to revive it? The indigenous knowledge as a heritage from the past must be carefully conserved. That is very, very important. How do we bring about the indigenous knowledge heritage and conserve it and put it in a new library, digital library? We should use digital technology to preserve indigenous knowledge. How do we do it? Like as I told you, on indigenous languages, my brother, Professor Sande Ojo, is from Nigeria, and we've been here together in South Africa. Very nice support I have from him always. We discussed about how do we also save all the African languages and how do we digitalize them, and we're now discussing very seriously about also even using our own. I mean, if people agree, I know it's difficult in Africa. The politics is too dirty and too complicated. But if they don't, and if they want really to nurture what is really what originated from Africa and value it, we should go for that, for that kind of value. So we'll see. We should have reverence for indigenous knowledge to prove what our elder Amadou Hapateba said about Africa's accumulated wisdom. Each time an elder dies, it is as if a library had burned down. So we don't want the library to burn down, the indigenous knowledge library to burn down. We want the indigenous knowledge library to be revived, digitalized, and really move and get included. And in the curriculum and the education system, we need to include it. We need to find how to do it. And as I just told you, I'm going to work on the STEM side, on the indigenous knowledge, origin of STEM, on the science, technology, engineering, mathematics, astronomy side. Those kinds of sides are the ones I very much like to work on and develop a very strong curriculum that I hope all other universities in Africa, not just Osiris University, should do it first. Then after Osiris does it, then I hope others will also, it could be a good example for others to follow it up. As we will experiment it first. I have done before, as I told you, non-Western science, because there was all this, their book on natural nature of science, which just simply says all non-Western science are primitive, especially Africans. There was a rejection, and where I had in Durham in 1994 in England, there was a conference, and I fought those guys very, very much, sincerely. And I used to teach a course called Ideas of Science, and I really was very, very, very angry with the way they attacked us. So the good thing is the British even press picked it up, and they put me on the news that Professor Mammo has been angry about this and so on. So I think there is a very important thing that we need to really work very hard to make sure that we actually revive the entire and indigenous knowledge that has been created, that the library should not collapse. So indigenous knowledge must not exclude local people. Even when we do the knowledge development, the local people should be involved in building more knowledge from the indigenous knowledge. Indigenous knowledge should enable to take action as much as enabling local people to produce new knowledge based on application of the knowledge inherited and the knowledge coming. So there is it will be very interesting because a lot of the knowledge comes from them. Ways must be found how we can include them. In the same way that we say, when we ask our students when they do engineering and so on, they need to also include the industries and so on. There must be a way also how we can, the people who actually have this resourceful knowledge, we should also find ways to include them. So the real difference is now harnessing local knowledge from the communities. We really need to harvest it now, very important, this indigenous knowledge. We need to find how it differs from different types of universal knowledge. We also need to compare it and find out how it differs from different types of knowledge. We need to draw from experiential knowledge also. What are the various experiences that people have? Is it the knowledge something they they generated from the experience they faced in life as they go on, and they develop it. How could we record it? How to derive the way to know from experience by also examining other non-experiential and even theoretical knowledge. Non-codifiable tacit knowledge must be also included, and to find ways to acknowledge and include them. If it's non-codifiable, how could we do it? How do we make tacit knowledge also be included in the indigenous knowledge is very, very important. So how to use local knowledge, data collection on the set of experiences generated by people in local communities is very important. Trying to find ways to discover how the local people have transmitted orally from one generation to the next is very important. How do they accept, learn, repeat, and pass the indigenous knowledge from generation to generation? How did this generational transmission happen from knowledge to knowledge? Where did it come? When did it originate? And so on. How is indigenous knowledge applied and used to solve problems and make decisions in local communities? How strongly has indigenous knowledge been embedded for the community not to give up based on the ongoing routines, practices, relationships, institutions, and rituals? How is it embedded with all these activities that's going on? Now, we need to also do research to rediscover the discovered or knowledge already. Africa has achieved scientific and technological sophistication in a number of fields, including astronomy, metallurgy, agricultural science, and medicine, prior to the Western invasion of the African continent. Before the West came, we had all this knowledge. Indigenous knowledge has a very rich historical heritage in Africa. The decolonization of education has to be done without any further delay to even bring the one that we already had just before the period when the Western intrusion came. How to do it requires a think tank on indigenous knowledge to include it systematically in the education curriculum. So even the United Nations has now put law, rights of indigenous people. In Article 29 of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, this is what is emphasized. Indigenous people are entitled to the recognition of the full ownership, control, and protection of their cultural and intellectual rights. They have the right to special measures, control, develop, protect their sciences, technologies, cultural manifestations, including human and other genetic sources, seeds, medicines, knowledge of properties of fauna and flora, oral traditions, literatures, designs, and visual and performing arts. Can you imagine? So where all this is there, the rule is not against us. Why are not all our universities including them? I do not know. So I think that's, so we need to, a new epistemic frames, Africa to move from an epistemology of exclusion to the epistemology of fusion, engage in developing inclusive framework by indigenous knowledge fully acknowledged in education curricula in Africa, by rediscovering an African gnosis, ways of knowing. That's what we should do. And I think we need indigenous knowledge with different ways of knowing, disciplinary based, problem based, work integrated based, action based, project based, develop a systematic teaching method by undertaking extended inquiry, however complex the problem to be investigated and addressed is.